Have you ever imagined receiving a mysterious text message at your husband's funeral that said, "I'm not dead, don't trust the kids"? Behind a family that seemed happy lies a cold-blooded scheme carefully plotted by two sons driven by greed and ambition. A widowed mother, already drowning in the grief of losing her husband, must now confront the most horrifying betrayal from her very own flesh and blood. And as the truth slowly unravels, the story is no longer just about an attempted murder, but a life-or-death battle for justice and truth. This is the journey of Elena, a woman forced to rise, turning tragedy into strength to expose everything. If you find this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Now let's step into that dark and haunting funeral, the place where the mystery begins. The funeral took place on a bleak afternoon. The sky over the port city of Rivermouth hung heavy gray clouds, stretching endlessly as if trying to conceal the sorrow below. The sea wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the sharp, salty chill of the water. Elena Duarte, wrapped in a thin black coat, felt her frail hands trembling in the cold gusts. She stood silently before the coffin lowered into the grave, her heart hollow with grief. The man who had walked beside her for more than 40 years, Ricardo Duarte, now remained only within a cold wooden box. There weren't many people at the funeral. A few close neighbors, some of Ricardo's old friends, and of course Elena's two sons, Adrian and Victor. To anyone else they looked like dutiful sons, dressed in dark suits, faces solemn. But to Elena every gesture felt unnatural. Adrian kept glancing at his watch, his posture restless, as if he were waiting for another appointment. Victor stood with his head slightly bowed, his eyes flat and unreadable, his lips pressed tightly together in silence. When the minister began his prayers, Elena clutched her handkerchief to keep herself from collapsing. In her heart, she longed for just one impossible moment that Ricardo would rise, take her hand, and assure her that this was nothing more than a nightmare. But the prayer went on, and the dull thud of shovels throwing earth onto the coffin crushed that hope. At that very moment, her phone vibrated inside her bag. At first, Elena meant to silence it. She couldn't allow anything to interrupt this solemn moment. But then her eyes caught the screen and her pulse froze. A message glared back at her. "I'm not dead. Don't trust the boys." Her breath caught. Her entire body trembled, her fingers locking around the phone as if afraid it might vanish. She read the words again and again, her heart pounding harder each time. Slowly she lifted her gaze toward Adrian and Victor. They stood there unchanged, their expressions composed. But now to Elena's eyes the mask of grief looked painfully false. She hurriedly slipped the phone back into her coat pocket, hiding her shock. No one could see this, not yet, and especially not her sons. When the service ended, Adrian came over and gently took her hand. "Mom, everything will be all right. We'll handle everything for you." His voice was soft, but to Elena it rang hollow, rehearsed. Victor only nodded, saying nothing. On the way home, Elena sat in silence in the back seat of the car, her thoughts storming. She pulled out her phone and typed, her fingers unsteady. "If you are Ricardo, say something only I would know." 10 minutes later, the screen lit up again. "Be careful, they're watching." Elena shuddered. The little wooden house by the shore no longer felt like a refuge. Whoever was sending these messages knew too much enough to suggest that Adrian and Victor were involved in Ricardo's death. She couldn't tell what was real and what was a cruel deception. If Ricardo was alive, then who had they just buried? And if he wasn't, who else could know these intimate family secrets? That night, Elena sat in her dimly lit living room, her gaunt face glowing under the soft yellow lamp. Outside, waves pounded against the rocks, echoing like the frantic beat of her own heart. She replayed the images of the funeral, Adrian's impatience, Victor's silence, the rushed way they had arranged everything. It all felt staged, as if rehearsed in advance. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the words of the message blazed before her. "I'm not dead. Don't trust the boys." It was less a statement than a warning, a hand dragging her out of blind trust. She began to recall every moment from the past months, Adrian's insistence on selling the shipyard, Victor's pressure for Ricardo to retire Isabella's cold, calculating eyes the first time she set foot in their home. Piece by piece they connected into a sinister chain. Near midnight she picked up her phone again, hoping for another clue. But the screen stayed dark, silent. She felt abandoned in a storm of suspicion. Had her husband truly died, and if not, what really happened in the so-called accident? It was in that moment that Elena realized a bitter truth. She couldn't rely on anyone, not even her own children. She would have to uncover the answers herself. And those answers she knew would be brutal. But without them, she would live the rest of her days in shadows. Outside, the waves crashed again, rattling the windows like a drumbeat of urgency. Elena straightened in her chair, her eyes sharpening with resolve. From this moment on, she was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a seeker of truth, and to find it, she would have to return to where it all began, the past of her family, where love and darkness had always lived side by side. Elena could not sleep that night. The strange messages echoed in her mind like a call from the shadows. Yet before she could make sense of what was happening, she felt the need to return to the past, to where everything had begun, to where she had once known Ricardo, her family, and the happiness that once seemed complete. The memories came back like an old film. The day she met Ricardo, the port city of Rivermouth was still poor. Ricardo was then a young engineer in a shipyard, thin in build but with bright eyes and a warm smile. He had little money, no grand career, but he carried within him an endless passion for the sea and for ships. Elena at the time was a young woman working at a small tailoring shop in the marketplace. Her gentle smile and skillful hands caught Ricardo's attention the very first time he saw her. Their love was not loud or flashy, but steady and sincere. Ricardo often came to meet Elena after her shifts, and together they walked along the shore, listening to the waves and speaking about their future. They dreamed of one day having a small wooden house overlooking the sea, where in the mornings they could hear the gulls, and in the evenings they could sit together on the porch watching the horizon glow red at sunset. After many years of hard work, they truly made that dream come true. That wooden house was where Elena now lived, and it held all the sweetest memories of her life. In those early years, the couple worked tirelessly. Ricardo built a small workshop next to the house, repairing and crafting wooden boats for the fishermen. Elena looked after the household, but also helped him with small tasks, sometimes bringing him tea, sometimes mending nets. Their life was not rich, but it was filled with laughter. When Adrian and Victor were born, the house became even livelier. Ricardo held the babies in his arms, his eyes glowing with happiness. He often placed them on the wooden workbench in the shop, showing them the planks, the nails, the hand planes, explaining that everything had a soul and would become a boat with a story to tell. Elena watched with pride in her heart. She believed her children would grow up with these simple values, learning to love and respect honest labor. The years passed peacefully. Each summer, the family of 4 rowed their little boat out into the bay to fish and sing together. Each winter, when the cold winds lashed against the wooden walls, the whole family gathered by the fire. Ricardo told sea stories to the boys, and Elena sewed clothes, her eyes warm as she looked at her husband and children. To Elena, that was the fullest happiness a woman could hope for. But over time, things began to change. When Adrian reached his teenage years, he started to show disdain for the workshop. He said the smell of wood, the oil, and the salt of the sea were all unbearable. He wanted a life of luxury, wanted to leave Rivermouth for the big city. Victor, though quieter, often followed his brother and was also influenced by him. Elena tried many times to bring her sons closer to their father, urging them to value the traditions Ricardo had built. But in their eyes, she saw a growing distance. Ricardo remained patient. He believed that one day, after facing enough of life's storms, his children would understand that what their parents had left them was the strongest foundation of all. He still brought them into the shop, still taught them how to craft a small boat, how to read the grain of wood to know its age, how to listen to the waves to sense the change of the wind. But his patience only seemed to fuel their resistance. As Adrian grew older, he sometimes raised his voice at his father, accusing him of lacking ambition. Elena felt both sorrow and worry. She saw that the happiness of their family was beginning to crack in ways she did not know how to mend. Many nights after the children had gone to bed, she and Ricardo sat on the porch looking out at the sea. Ricardo sighed, saying perhaps he had been too idealistic to believe that love and honest work could hold a family together forever. Elena held his hand, assuring him that everything would be fine. But deep inside, a vague fear had already begun to take root. To keep the family together, Elena did everything she could. She was gentle with the children, constantly coaxing and comforting them. She urged Ricardo to give in a little to let the boys choose their own paths. But she knew deep down that the distance was only growing. Adrian left to study in the city, then became entangled in speculative ventures. Victor became obsessed with stocks and risky loans. When they returned to Rivermouth, they were no longer the boys who once ran around the workshop. They had become men driven by ambitions larger than anything Ricardo could have imagined. Standing in the present, recalling those memories, Elena felt her heart ache. Those peaceful days that seemed eternal had in fact set the stage for a greater tragedy. In her memories, Ricardo remained the gentleman who loved his family and devoted himself to his sons. But in that very love, perhaps he had unknowingly nurtured greed and betrayal. Elena sat motionless by the window. Outside, the night sea roared. She closed her eyes and let the memories flood back. From the earliest days of happiness to the first signs of distance, all of it flowed into the present, where her husband lay in a coffin, and she received a mysterious message. And in her heart, one great question pounded louder and louder. What had truly turned the sons she once held, once hoped for, into such cold and distant men? The question had no answer yet, but it opened the door to another truth, one Elena would be forced to confront in the days to come. And that truth, she sensed, would be even more merciless than the memories she had just relived. After the years of peace, when Adrian and Victor grew older, Elena began to clearly sense the changes in each of her sons. The boys who once ran around the shipyard, who once lit up with joy when hearing their father's stories of the sea, now carried ambitions that were strange ambitions far beyond anything Elena and Ricardo had ever imagined. Adrian, the elder son, had always been the more decisive one. Even in high school, he revealed a sharp intelligence laced with arrogance. He often argued with his teachers, sometimes openly dismissing what he called outdated ideas. When he entered law school in the city, Adrian became even more distant. He came home rarely, and whenever he did, his eyes carried disdain for the modest wooden house by the shore. To him, the workshop was nothing more than a relic incapable of bringing any kind of future. Victor was different. He was quieter, less expressive, but no less ambitious. When Adrian first left home, Victor stayed behind in Rivermouth for a while, helping Ricardo in the workshop. Yet Elena noticed that whenever he worked, he only went through the motions. His mind was elsewhere. He read books on investment and finance, dreaming endlessly about the wealth promised by those pages. Time passed, and Adrian abandoned his studies, plunging into risky ventures. At first, he returned boasting of small profits, which made Elena both worried and hopeful that her son would eventually find a steady path. But soon debts began piling up. Adrian borrowed from friends, then from loan sharks. The arrogance in his eyes was now mixed with something darker and more dangerous. Victor fared no better. When he followed his brother to the city, he quickly succumbed to the temptations of stocks and speculation. At first it was small trades, but they grew into high-stakes gambles. Each failure left him more anxious and unstable. He began lying to cover his losses, inventing excuses whenever he needed money. Elena saw all these changes, and her heart twisted in pain. She tried repeatedly to advise them, spending hours beside her sons, reminding them of the simple values of their family. But her words could not reach the hearts already consumed by ambition and greed. Ricardo, too, was heartbroken, but he was more uncompromising. He once shouted at Adrian after learning his son was involved in a shady deal. He once struck Victor when he discovered him stealing money from the workshop drawer. But instead of awakening them, these confrontations only deepened their resentment toward their father. Tension within the family grew heavier each day. The dinner table, once the warmest place in the house, became filled with bitter arguments. Adrian constantly criticized his father, calling him a stubborn man blind to opportunities. Victor stayed silent, but his eyes brimmed with defiance. Ricardo stood firm, refusing to sell the workshop no matter how many offers came. To him it was not just a livelihood, but the soul of the family. But to Adrian and Victor, it was nothing more than an asset to be turned into money. When Adrian married Isabella, the distance widened further. Isabella was a city woman, elegantly dressed, her voice sharp and cold. From the very first visit, she sneered. A shabby wooden house like this, how could it be called a home? Her words cut straight into Elena's heart. She said nothing, but inside she knew Isabella would only push her sons further away from their roots. Victor, though unmarried, was no longer attached to home either. He moved to the city with his brother, only visiting occasionally. Each time he returned, he dropped hints that his parents should think about old age, that they should sell the workshop and live a more comfortable life. Elena cried many nights in silence. She asked herself what had made her sons change so much. Perhaps she and Ricardo had been too focused on building a peaceful home to notice the storms rising inside their children. Perhaps their unconditional love had unknowingly turned into indulgence. Ricardo was more resolute. He told his wife that they must not give in, that the family needed to preserve its core values. But Elena knew he was hurting too. Many times she found him sitting alone in the workshop, his eyes distant, his hand stroking the wooden planks as if seeking comfort. In those days, the wooden house by the sea no longer echoed with laughter. Instead, it was filled with arguments, cold stares, and heavy silences. Elena felt as though she were standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the sweet memories of the past, the other toward the harsh reality of the present, and deep within her a strong premonition grew. She began to realize that Adrian and Victor's changes were not just youthful dreams gone astray. Behind them was something else, a darker shadow taking shape. And then one day, when she overheard Adrian mention Ricardo's life insurance, Elena felt her blood run cold. A question rose in her mind, chilling her to the core. Had her sons, the very children she once held in her arms, begun plotting something far beyond ordinary betrayal? After hearing Adrian mention Ricardo's life insurance, Elena could no longer shake off the dread inside her. His words had echoed across the dinner table beneath the dim yellow light that revealed the cold expression on her eldest son's face. Adrian said that these days no one could predict what might happen. Their father was old, his health declining, and it would be best to think of their mother and the family's future. He bluntly suggested Ricardo sign papers to increase his life insurance policy so that if something unfortunate happened, his mother would have a large sum of money to secure her life. Ricardo set his bowl down, anger flashing in his eyes. He asked if this was really out of concern for his mother, or if it was simply the money Adrian was after. Victor sat quietly at his side, saying nothing, but Elena could see that his eyes betrayed agreement. The air in the room grew heavy. Elena sat still, her heart pounding, certain that from this moment on nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Adrian and Victor applied constant pressure. Sometimes they spoke of Ricardo's age, sometimes of the risks of working in the shop. Isabella, Adrian's wife, also stepped in. One evening, she looked directly at Elena and said it was irresponsible for a man to let his family live without a safety net should he pass away. Her words were sharp-sounding, both like advice and a command. Ricardo understood their intent, but rather than confront them openly, he chose silence and observation. He began writing down conversations, hiding scraps of notes in the workshop. He wrote that his sons wanted him to sign the insurance papers, that he felt something was wrong. Elena accidentally found one of those slips in his work jacket pocket. It contained only 2 words: "Be careful." The unease grew heavier. Ricardo was a cautious man, not easily swayed by empty promises. He even quietly went to see a private detective in a nearby city, asking him to monitor Adrian and Victor's activities. Elena knew nothing of this. She only saw her husband grow more withdrawn, speaking less, smiling less. He often stood silently at the workshop door, staring out at the distant sea, as if searching for an answer. Meanwhile, Adrian and Victor became more impatient. They no longer spoke only of life insurance, but openly discussed selling the shop. They brought figures, estimates, promises that if they sold, the family would live differently, no longer struggling. But Ricardo stood firm. He said the shop was not just an asset, but the soul of the family, a place that held memories and years of sweat and labor. The more he refused, the more forceful Adrian and Victor became. Adrian often raised his voice, even slamming his hand on the table, calling his parents stubborn. Victor said little, but his cold stare made Elena shiver. She saw in their attitudes not only blind ambition, but also a simmering resentment, as if their parents were the greatest obstacle in their path. One evening, Elena happened to overhear a conversation between her sons in the backyard. They spoke in low voices, but every word cut into her like a blade. Adrian said that if their father would just sign the insurance papers, everything would be much easier. Victor replied that if he refused, there were still other ways to get what they wanted. Elena froze in horror but bit her lip, not daring to reveal that she had heard them. From then on, she lived in constant fear. Each time Ricardo went to the shop, she worried something terrible would happen. She began noticing small details like Adrian's calculating eyes or Victor's suspicious silence. Even Isabella often suggested that her in-laws move into a retirement home where they would be cared for while their children managed the family's assets. Ricardo increasingly felt the danger closing in. He urged Elena to stay calm, then handed her a small key, telling her that if anything unusual happened, she should open a secret drawer in the shop to find the truth. Elena did not fully understand, but the gravity in his eyes silenced her questions. In those days, the atmosphere in the house grew suffocating. Elena felt as though she were living in a play where her sons performed as dutiful children before neighbors, yet behind the scenes plotted something sinister. Every meal was thick with pretense, every word layered with hidden meaning. Elena began to lose sleep. She heard the wind whistling through the windows, the waves crashing against the cliffs, all of it like omens of an approaching storm. Inside her, a deep fear was taking shape. She knew Ricardo had become the target of some scheme and that her own sons were behind it. But what exactly that scheme was and when it would strike, she could not tell. And then one morning a scream erupted from the workshop. Elena rushed down to find Ricardo collapsed on the floor, his face pale, his breath faint. Adrian and Victor appeared almost immediately, feigning panic as they called for an ambulance. They claimed it was an accident, while Ricardo was checking the old electrical system. But in that brief instant, when Elena caught their eyes, she shivered. Behind their performance of worry, she saw something else cold and calculating. The ambulance carried Ricardo away, leaving Elena standing frozen in the workshop, where the acrid smell of burned wires still lingered. She stood there, her heart breaking, and in her mind echoed the words she had once overheard. If he does not sign, there are still other ways. That was the moment Elena realized the nightmare had truly begun. Ricardo was taken to the hospital in critical condition. The doctors said he had been poisoned by toxic fumes while inspecting burned electrical wires, but Elena did not believe it. She knew Ricardo was not a careless man. In decades of working at the shop, he had never once suffered a serious accident. She sat at his bedside, clutching his cold hand, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst. Adrian and Victor appeared at the hospital constantly, but not out of concern for their father. Elena noticed how often they whispered to each other in the hallway, their faces tense. When they entered the hospital room, they put on a false front, their eyes glistening as if ready to weep. But when Elena looked closely, she saw only emptiness and coldness in their gaze. Ricardo drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he opened his eyes, he tried to speak, but his voice was weak and broken. Elena leaned close to his lips. He managed to whisper a few fragmented words. "Be careful." Elena burst into tears, her tears falling onto her husband's face. She understood he had already sensed the plot tightening around their family. But only a few days later, Ricardo was gone. The doctors declared acute respiratory failure as the cause. All the procedures were rushed through so quickly it left Elena stunned. Adrian and Victor arranged the funeral, swiftly justifying it by saying their father had always been a simple man who disliked ceremony. Elena wanted to keep him close a little longer, but her sons insisted. She felt as if an invisible hand were pushing her away from the truth. The funeral passed quickly. Few people attended, mostly familiar neighbors. Elena sat silently before the coffin, her tears streaming. Meanwhile, Adrian kept checking his phone, and Victor stayed silent, his eyes dark. Elena felt lost within her own family. After the funeral, before her grief had even eased, she received a message. "I'm not dead. Don't trust the boys." She trembled, her heart seeming to stop. She sat frozen in the empty wooden house, staring at those short words in disbelief. Could Ricardo still be alive? Or was someone trying to reveal to her a terrible truth? Elena began to notice strange inconsistencies. The death certificate had been signed hastily without any thorough investigation. The hospital report was sparse, just a few vague lines. When she pressed for answers, the doctor replied evasively. She remembered Ricardo's eyes before he died, full of warning eyes that seemed to tell her nothing about this was simple. She also realized that right after the funeral ended, Adrian and Victor had already started discussing the steps to claim the insurance money. Elena accidentally overheard them in the living room. Adrian whispered that everything was arranged, that within weeks they would receive a large sum. Victor nodded, but his voice betrayed unease. What if Mother starts to suspect? Adrian reassured him. She is weak. She cannot do anything. Those words cut into Elena like a blade. She trembled, covering her mouth to keep from crying out. At that moment, she knew she was alone in this battle. The sons she had raised and once placed all her hopes in had now become strangers. Elena decided to examine Ricardo's papers. She went to the workshop and opened the hidden drawer her husband had once mentioned. Inside was a small packet of documents and a notebook. In the notebook, Ricardo had detailed his suspicions. From Adrian pressuring him to sign the insurance papers to secretive conversations between the brothers, he had recorded it all. He even noted times, places, and the names of a few strangers Adrian had met. Among the documents, Elena discovered copies of the insurance contract that had been altered several times. The amount had been doubled within a matter of months. The signature on the papers was shaky, unlike Ricardo's usual handwriting. Elena knew her husband was cautious. He would never have signed something so important unless he had been tricked or coerced. The more she read, the clearer it became that Ricardo's death had not been an accident. It was the result of a carefully calculated plan, and the masterminds were none other than her own two sons. The nights that followed were filled with nightmares. Elena replayed every moment of the funeral, every false expression, every evasive word. She was terrified, yet within her a resolve began to grow. She could not let Ricardo die in vain, and she could not allow herself to become the next victim. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, her phone vibrated again. This time, the message contained only 4 words. Seek the truth. Elena looked up, her heart pounding. Who was sending these messages? Was Ricardo truly still alive, or was there someone else who had seen everything? She felt that in the darkness surrounding her, an invisible hand was guiding her. But whether that hand was leading her toward the light or pushing her deeper into the abyss, she could not yet tell, and so Elena decided to take the next step. She would follow the clues Ricardo had left behind, meet the people he had spoken to, uncover each hidden layer. Because she understood that what she had discovered so far was only the beginning of a story far more horrifying. After the night she received the message, "Seek the truth," Elena hardly slept. She sat by the window watching the faint moonlight stretch across the sea. The sound of the waves crashing again and again was like a heartbeat urging her forward. Inside, her fear and determination intertwined. If what she had read in Ricardo's notebook was true, then his death was not fate, but a deliberate act of murder. And the masterminds were the very two sons she had raised all her life. The next day, Elena decided to follow the clues. She reopened the notebook Ricardo had hidden in the secret drawer. Inside were hurried notes marked with times and suspicious conversations. One name appeared repeatedly, a pharmacy on the outskirts of town where Adrian often went. Ricardo had also noted that Victor had withdrawn money from the family's joint account multiple times under dubious circumstances. Elena carried these notes to meet Manuel, an old retired shipbuilder and a close friend of Ricardo's. After reading through them, Manuel frowned, sitting in silence for a long time. Finally, he admitted he had once seen Adrian at the night market speaking with a man known for dealing in chemicals. Manuel could not be sure what they discussed, but the memory unsettled him. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The fragments were beginning to fit together, painting a shadowy picture. That evening, back at home, another message arrived. Check the bank account. Trembling, she opened the computer and logged into Ricardo's account. Sure enough, she found several suspicious withdrawals made in the months before his death. Large sums had been taken, all signed with his electronic signature. Elena knew Ricardo would never authorize such transactions. Once again, forgery was staring her in the face. The next day, Elena went to the bank to ask. The staff told her the transactions had been verified with proper documents bearing Ricardo's signature. When she requested to see the originals, they refused, citing confidentiality. As she left full of doubts, she overheard two employees whispering that a young man who looked very much like Victor had been coming to the bank often during that period. Back at the wooden house, Elena felt the air around her grow suffocating. She looked at the family photo on the wall where Ricardo stood between his sons, his eyes kind, his smile warm. And now those very sons filled her with terror. Elena buried her face in her hands and wept, but quickly wiped away her tears. She could not collapse. The phone buzzed again, short and direct as before. Find Detective Callahan. She had never heard that name. It was not mentioned in Ricardo's notebook either, but instinct told her this was important. She began asking old acquaintances. After several days, Manuel told her that Ricardo had once met a man named Stephen Callahan, a private detective known for his integrity who often investigated financial fraud. Elena followed the address Manuel gave her to a small office on the city's outskirts. The wooden door was worn, the sign faded, but inside was a middle-aged man, solidly built with sharp eyes. Stephen Callahan confirmed that Ricardo had indeed hired him just weeks before the accident. Ricardo had suspected a scheme within his own family and wanted evidence. Callahan pulled out a thin file containing a few photographs and a recording device. He explained that Ricardo had provided him with information about Adrian and Victor's secret meetings. In one photo, Adrian was shaking hands with a stranger at the night market. Another showed Victor leaving the bank at night. Elena's hands trembled as she looked at them. Callahan played the recording. The sound was faint but clear enough. It was Adrian's voice, quiet but firm. "As long as father signs the insurance papers, everything will be much easier." Then came Victor's voice in reply. "If he doesn't sign, there are other ways." Elena clutched her chest, her breath caught. The very words she had once overheard now played back as undeniable proof. Callahan reassured Elena that this was only the beginning of the file. He was still gathering evidence, and what he had might one day bring the case to light. But he also warned her that Adrian and Victor were not just after money. They might already have a plan to remove her as well, to seize everything. Elena left with the file in her hands, filled with fear but also a glimmer of hope. At least she was not alone. Someone else knew the truth. There was evidence and a path toward justice. That night, Elena sat at her table, laying out Ricardo's notes alongside Callahan's file. The pieces fit together more and more. Ricardo's death was not an accident, but a crime carefully concealed. And now she realized she might be the next target. Outside the window, the sea roared. Elena closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath. She knew her fight was only beginning, and in that very moment her phone buzzed again. This time the message contained only 3 words: "They will return." Elena froze, her heart nearly bursting. Those words opened the door to a new terror. She did not yet understand, but her instincts told her that an even greater storm was coming. The message with 3 words, "They will return," left Elena stunned. She sat frozen, her trembling hands resting on the old wooden table, her eyes fixed on the phone screen. A vague yet profound fear rose within her. Who was sending her these lines, and what did return mean? Was it a warning that Adrian and Victor were about to take the next step in their scheme? Elena decided she could not simply sit and wait. She went back to see Stephen Callahan to ask more about what Ricardo had entrusted to him before his death. Callahan searched his drawer and pulled out another envelope Ricardo had left, instructing that if anything happened, it should be given to Elena. Inside were detailed notes of Adrian and Victor's secret meetings, along with the phone number of a man named Morales, noted by Ricardo as an intermediary. Elena went home and tried calling the number. A hoarse, cautious male voice answered. When Elena mentioned Ricardo, the line went silent for a long moment before disconnecting. But only half an hour later, Elena received a text from an unknown number. "Do not call again. If you want to know the truth, come to the abandoned warehouse at the docks at midnight tomorrow." Elena's heart pounded wildly. She knew it could be a trap, but it might also be the key to unlocking everything. That night she tossed and turned, unable to sleep, thinking of Ricardo, of the warning in his eyes before he died. She told herself that if she did not uncover the truth, her husband's sacrifice would remain forever buried in darkness. The following night, Elena wrapped herself in a long black coat and walked to the docks in the cold wind. The abandoned warehouse loomed silently, its rusty doors creaking. Inside, a dim light spilled across the damp cement floor. A tall, gaunt man emerged from the shadows, his face hollow. He introduced himself as Morales, once a business partner of Adrian's. Morales explained that months earlier, Adrian had sought him out to purchase a dangerous chemical, using the excuse of shipyard experiments. But Morales knew that was just a pretext. He had overheard Adrian telling Victor that if their father refused to sign the insurance papers, then one small accident would be enough to end it all. At first, Morales stayed silent out of fear, but when he heard Ricardo had died, guilt consumed him. He had thought of reporting it, but Adrian threatened to kill him if he spoke. Elena listened to every word, tears streaming down her cheeks. She asked Morales why he chose to speak now. He replied that he knew Adrian and Victor were not finished, that they would go further and might even target her. Morales handed Elena a small USB drive, inside of which was a recording of Adrian discussing the chemical purchase. The voice was unmistakable. Back home, Elena played the recording on her computer. Adrian's words rang out clearly. Ricardo had been right. Everything was part of a scheme. Elena collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. She was consumed by grief and fury, but at the same time she knew she now held the first real piece of evidence, something that could expose it all. Just as she was lost in thought, her phone buzzed again. The new message contained only 2 words: "Be careful." Elena jolted her eyes, scanning the room, feeling as though she were being watched. She pulled the curtains shut, peering into the darkness outside. From afar came the sound of an engine, then silence. That night, Elena barely slept. She placed the USB in a drawer and locked it, vowing to protect it at all costs. It was the only proof that could bring justice for Ricardo. But she also understood that if Adrian and Victor discovered she had it, they would not let her live in peace. The next day, Elena met Callahan again and showed him the USB. After listening to the recording, Callahan confirmed it was crucial evidence. He promised to help her build a complete case, but warned that things were becoming increasingly dangerous. Adrian and Victor might already suspect that Elena was following their trail. On her way home, Elena felt a heavy dread. She began to notice strange signs around the house. A strange car parked outside the gate at night and then disappeared. A soft tapping on the window woke her in the middle of the night. She was no longer sure whether she was truly being watched or if fear was clouding her mind. For Elena, the truth was no longer uncertain. Ricardo had been murdered by his own sons for insurance money and property. She had the first piece of evidence, an ally in Callahan, and a faint path to justice. But at the same time, the darkness was closing in. As she sat in the wooden house, the dim light casting shadows across her gaunt face, Elena realized her next step would decide everything. She could take the evidence to the police, but if it was not enough, she would become the prey. She could stay silent, but that would mean Ricardo died in vain. In the midst of her turmoil, the phone buzzed once more. A new message appeared: "Trust no one." Elena sat frozen, her heart racing. She understood now that this fight had gone far beyond the family. Behind Adrian and Victor, there might be other forces pulling the strings. Her eyes hardened with resolve. She knew from now on every step had to be cautious, because a single mistake could cost her life. And in that moment she realized she had stepped deeper into a dark labyrinth where even more terrifying secrets waited to be uncovered. Elena knew she could no longer remain silent, gathering evidence in the shadows. The mysterious messages, the warnings, and the file Callahan had given her all led to one undeniable truth. Adrian and Victor were no longer ordinary sons. They had become a threat, and to move forward she had to face them directly. The chance came one evening when Adrian and Victor returned to the wooden house. Both entered with cold, expressionless faces. Adrian sat down, removed his tie, and let his eyes sweep over Elena, as if scrutinizing her. Victor was quieter, but his silence was even more frightening than words. Elena felt her heart race wildly, but she forced herself to stay calm. Dinner unfolded in strained awkwardness. Elena served the food, her hands trembling slightly, yet she kept her composure. Adrian began to speak, saying it was time the family reconsidered the matter of the workshop. His tone was smooth, as though the words had been rehearsed. Victor echoed him, insisting that their mother was old, that she should not cling to a shabby wooden house, and that selling it was the wiser choice. Elena set her chopsticks down and looked straight at them. She asked a question that froze the entire room. "Did your father really die in an accident, or was it by your own hands?" The air grew heavy at once. Adrian faltered briefly, then laughed bitterly. "Mother, what are you saying? Are you delusional?" Victor stayed silent, but his eyes flashed with something sharp and dangerous. Elena did not back down. She told them she had found Ricardo's notes, that she knew about the withdrawn money and the secret meetings. She stressed that she had evidence, things they could not deny. Adrian narrowed his eyes, lips curling. "Evidence? What evidence do you have?" Elena said nothing more, only held her gaze steady. Her silence unsettled Adrian. He turned to Victor, giving a signal. Victor nodded slightly, as if to confirm what Elena already suspected. In that moment, she knew her fears were justified. The dinner turned into a silent battle of wits. Adrian tried to manipulate her, saying everything they did was for the family, that they wanted her to live better, but Elena heard every hollow gap in his words. She felt as though she were standing before a stage where her sons were playing the roles of dutiful children, while behind the mask lurked a monstrous truth. Dinner ended in silence. When Adrian and Victor left, Elena realized something had changed. They now suspected her. They knew she was no longer the weak, gullible mother she once had been. From this moment on, the game had shifted. That night, Elena called Callahan and told him everything. His voice was grave as he warned her that she had taken a risk. He said Adrian and Victor might act quickly if they felt threatened, but Elena replied that she had no choice. If she stayed silent, she would forever be trapped in the shadows. A few days later, her fears became reality. Returning from the market, she found the gate ajar, though she had locked it before leaving. Inside the drawer where she had hidden the USB had been disturbed. Someone had clearly searched through it. Elena's body went cold as she rushed to check. The USB was still there, but she knew Adrian and Victor had begun to act. Elena decided to hide the USB elsewhere. She wrapped it in a cloth and buried it deep beneath the tree behind the house. When she finished, she looked up at the gray sky, feeling both relief and dread. If they discovered she had hidden it, they would not hesitate to confront her directly. The next day, Adrian returned alone. He walked in, slammed his briefcase on the table, his voice edged with menace. "Mother, we need to be clear. I know you are holding something you should not." Elena raised her head, her eyes calm but firm. "If you are not afraid, why are you so desperate?" Adrian stepped closer, his face darkening. He whispered as though he did not want anyone else to hear. "You don't understand. Things have gone too far. If you keep resisting, you will pay the price." Elena's skin prickled with fear, but she did not flinch. She answered slowly, clearly, "I lost your father, and I will not let this truth be buried." At that moment, Adrian's eyes flared with danger. His fists clenched, but he restrained himself, turned, and left without another word. Elena knew then that the real storm was about to break. That night, just as she closed the window, her phone buzzed again. The message appeared 4 words. "They have found out." Elena gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding. She understood that the first confrontation had only just begun, and ahead lay far more brutal steps. After the message, "They have found out," Elena knew her time of safety was over. In the days that followed, she lived in constant vigilance. Every sound outside the porch, every shadow passing the window made her startle. She no longer dared to go out alone at night, and even during the day, she felt as though invisible eyes were watching her. Callahan advised her to leave the wooden house and stay elsewhere to avoid Adrian and Victor's surveillance, but Elena refused. She said this was the only place that still kept Ricardo's memories, and if she left, all the evidence could be destroyed. She knew she was taking a risk, but she also understood that the longer she stayed, the closer danger came. One afternoon, while returning from the market, Elena noticed a black car following her. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, but the farther she went, the more it maintained the same distance behind her. Her heart raced. Nearing a small slope that led into the woods, she suddenly turned down a different road along the coast. The car still followed. Elena gripped the wheel tightly, trying to remain calm, but her palms were drenched in sweat. On a deserted stretch, the car suddenly sped up and drew alongside. Elena panicked, swerving hard and nearly crashing into the cliffside. She realized this was no ordinary surveillance but a deliberate chase. In that moment, she remembered Callahan's warning. Adrian and Victor could strike at any time. Elena fought to keep distance, weaving her way through narrow roads. At last, she veered sharply into an alley, and the larger car behind could not follow, leaving only the blare of its horn echoing. Elena stopped, her whole body trembling. She knew she had just escaped death by a hair's breadth. That night she called Callahan. He came immediately, his face grave. He confirmed Adrian and Victor had moved to direct action. They no longer wanted to intimidate her, they wanted to eliminate her. Callahan urged her to relocate to a safe house, but Elena shook her head. She said the evidence was still at home, and she would not let them destroy it so easily. Still, for her safety, Callahan gave her a small device, a button that worked as an alarm. He told her if she ever felt danger, all she needed to do was press it, and he would know her location at once. Elena accepted it and hid it carefully in her coat pocket. A few days later, the threat escalated. While walking by the bay early in the morning, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning back, she saw two strange men in black coats, their eyes menacing. Elena quickened her pace, but they matched her stride. She hurried onto the path leading uphill, the sea wind whipping her face, her heartbeat thundering. Near a deserted area, one of the men suddenly lunged, blocking her path. Elena staggered back, but the other closed in from behind. She screamed, struggling to break free, and in desperation pressed the alarm button in her pocket. Within minutes, the sound of a car horn pierced the air. Callahan arrived, braking hard nearby. The two men fled at once. Elena collapsed, gasping for breath, her body shaking. Callahan lifted her up, his eyes more serious than ever. He told her plainly this was no longer intimidation but an organized murder plot. Elena knew her life now hung by a fragile thread. But she also knew that if she surrendered to fear, Ricardo's death would be forgotten and Adrian and Victor would seize everything. She looked out at the sea, her eyes burning with determination. That evening, Elena and Callahan sat together in the wooden house. Callahan opened a file and said he had uncovered new leads. According to him, not only Adrian and Victor were involved, but there was another figure behind them, someone who had helped forge documents and stage Ricardo's death. But the identity of that person was still unknown. Elena clenched her hands. She realized the truth was far more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. The chase was only the beginning. Behind it, another power was orchestrating everything, perhaps the key to the entire scheme. As they discussed, Elena's phone buzzed again. This message was unlike the others. "If you want to live, go to the place where Ricardo hid the secret." Elena looked at Callahan, her eyes wide in shock. She remembered the small key Ricardo had given her before he died, saying it would unlock the truth. The dark curtains seemed to be lifting little by little. But at the same time, Elena felt she was being pulled into a game more dangerous than ever, and this game might force her to confront directly the one pulling all the strings. The message mentioning the place where Ricardo had hidden his secret left Elena nearly paralyzed. She sat in the small room, her eyes dim under the faint yellow light. At once she remembered the small key Ricardo had given her before his death. At that time he had not explained much, only told her that if something happened, she should keep it safe, and one day it would unlock the truth. Elena had always carried it with her but never thought she would have to use it. Callahan noticed her troubled expression and asked about the key. Elena, trembling, pulled it from her coat pocket. It was a small brass key, old and worn, with a strange symbol etched onto its shaft that she had never understood. Callahan studied it, saying Ricardo must have prepared for the worst long ago. He suggested they search for the place it might open. The next day they returned to the workshop where Ricardo had spent his life. Elena stood still for a long while, breathing in the familiar scent of wood. Callahan began examining every corner from the workbench to the old cabinets. At last he discovered a hidden drawer beneath the desk where Ricardo often sat. The lock matched Elena's key perfectly. Her hands shook as she slid the key in and turned it. A click echoed. The drawer opened to reveal a small wooden box tightly sealed. Elena lifted it out, the weight heavy in her hands. When she opened it, inside was a thick file and an old leather-bound journal. Together they sat down and began to read. The file contained copies of insurance contracts, money transfer documents, and forged signatures. Ricardo had quietly collected evidence for months, recording every small detail. Among the items was a tape sealed in plastic. When Callahan played it, Adrian's voice rang out clear and sharp. "If he will not sign, we will make him sign." Elena covered her mouth, tears rising. She now knew Ricardo had not died in a simple accident. He had understood exactly what was happening and had worked in silence to leave her a path toward the truth. In the journal Ricardo had written of his suspicions. He noted dates when Adrian met with strangers, the sums that disappeared from the account, and the heated arguments at home. In one passage, Ricardo wrote of his fear for Elena, fearing that once he was gone, she would become the next target. Reading those lines, Elena trembled, torn between anguish and determination. After examining the entire file, Callahan confirmed it was vital evidence, but he stressed that this meant Adrian and Victor surely knew of its existence as well. They had already gone too far, and they would not stop until they reclaimed everything. Elena nodded, but she no longer felt weak as before. A new strength surged inside her. She knew Ricardo had placed his final trust in her, and she could not fail him. Just then, a sudden noise came from outside the workshop door. Elena startled quickly, putting the wooden box back into the drawer and locking it. Callahan signaled for silence, moving cautiously to the door. They heard footsteps, heavy, then stopping. When Callahan opened the door, the yard outside was empty, but Elena felt certain someone had been there watching their every move. That night, Elena could not sleep. She opened Ricardo's journal again, reading each line over and over. She felt the loneliness and vigilance her husband had endured before his death, but within it she also saw his resilience. He had not surrendered to the schemes of his sons, but instead had left her a way to continue the fight. The next morning, Callahan suggested moving all the files to a safer place, but Elena hesitated. She feared that if the evidence left the house, it would be discovered and stolen. In the end, they agreed to copy part of it, keeping the originals in the workshop, while Callahan secured the copies elsewhere. As soon as they finished, another message appeared on Elena's phone. This time it was no vague warning, but a direct line. "Tomorrow night they will act." Elena froze, her hands shaking as she held the phone. This warning was not speculation, it was a clear signal. She turned to Callahan, her eyes filled with worry. He said gravely that this proved someone in the shadows knew Adrian and Victor's every move, but whether that person was friend or foe, they could not yet tell. Inside Elena, fear surged, yet with it came a strange clarity. The confrontation was about to enter a new stage, and this time she might see the raw truth about her own children. She clenched the key tightly, remembering Ricardo's eyes before he died. Elena knew this battle had gone beyond the boundaries of family. It had become a fight for survival, where every step could demand blood in return. And in the heavy silence of the afternoon, Elena understood that tomorrow night would be the turning point. It would not only decide her fate, but might also reveal the true face of those pulling the strings behind the curtain. The following night came faster than Elena expected. The sky over Rivermouth was dark, thick clouds rolling in like the herald of a violent storm. The wooden house stood silent in the wind, faint yellow light spilling through the window, revealing Elena's thin figure in the living room. On the table, Ricardo's journal lay open beside it. The small brass key glimmered dimly. Elena clutched the alarm device Callahan had given her, her heart pounding like a relentless drum. Near midnight, the sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. Elena stiffened, stepping quietly toward the window. In the darkness, she saw headlights sweeping across the road leading to the house. A car stopped and two figures stepped out. Though their faces were hidden, Elena knew it was Adrian and Victor. The sons she had once held close, now returning as predators in the night. The wooden door rattled under heavy knocks. Adrian's cold voice echoed. "Mother, we need to talk right now." Elena did not answer, only stepped back, fighting to stay calm. Victor's voice followed, deep and firm. "If you still have it, give it to us, and this will all end." Elena knew this was the decisive moment. She looked once at the journal, then at Ricardo's portrait on the wall. His kind eyes seemed to speak to her. She clenched her fist, stepped toward the door and spoke through it, her voice trembling, yet resolute. "You killed your father and now you want to kill me too." Silence fell, then Adrian's bitter laugh rang out. "If you know everything, then you know there is no turning back." The door burst open and the two men stormed inside. Elena retreated, clutching the alarm device. Just then Callahan appeared at the window, his figure standing tall. He shouted, ordering them to stop. Adrian and Victor froze, stunned by the ambush, but they quickly regained composure. Adrian stepped forward, glaring at Callahan. "Do you really think you can stop us? This is family business. Outsiders have no right to interfere." Callahan stood firm, holding up the file and the USB. "Every crime you committed has been recorded. Once the police see this, you will have no escape." For a moment, Victor lunged forward to snatch it, but Elena cried out, "Stop, it is over." Her scream shook the room, echoing years of pain and despair. Adrian paused, his eyes flickering, but then hardened again. The standoff grew unbearable. Suddenly the wail of police sirens cut through the night outside. Callahan had alerted them, and they had arrived just in time. Blue and red lights flashed across the darkness. Adrian and Victor exchanged a desperate look, realizing their plan had collapsed. They tried to flee but were quickly subdued. Elena stood frozen, her whole body trembling. As she watched her sons led away in handcuffs, tears streamed down her face. They were not tears of triumph, but of unbearable sorrow. She had lost her husband, and now she was losing her sons. Yet deep inside, she knew the truth had finally come to light, and Ricardo had at last received justice. After the police left, silence settled once more over the wooden house. Elena sat down, staring around the familiar room. On the table, the journal remained open, its pages stained with tears. Callahan placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking softly. "You did what had to be done. Ricardo would be proud of you." Elena raised her eyes to her husband's portrait. She whispered like a vow, "I kept my promise." The truth was not buried. Outside, the sea wind roared, waves crashing against the cliffs. In that relentless sound, Elena felt lighter than she had in years. The darkness had been torn away, though her heart now carried scars that would never heal. That nightmare night had ended, but Elena knew her life would never return to what it once was. And from that pain, she came to understand something profound. The truth, no matter how cruel, must be revealed. Only by facing it can people free themselves from the chains of darkness. After the nightmare night, everything seemed to have ended with Adrian and Victor's arrest, but in truth it was only the beginning of a long haunting. The trial drew the attention of the entire town of Rivermouth. The evidence Callahan gathered, along with Ricardo's journal and documents, left the courtroom in shock. No one could believe that two sons had so coldly planned to murder their father for money and inheritance. Adrian, throughout the trial, kept a frozen face, his eyes burning with resentment. Victor, on the other hand, often bowed his head, his hands trembling as though guilt was eating away at him. When the final sentence was handed down, life imprisonment for both Elena nearly collapsed. The last trace of trust she had for her children crumbled to ashes. But fate was even harsher. Only a few months later, Adrian was found hanged in his cell. His death shook the prison. Some said it was punishment from his conscience. Others claimed it was simply his way to escape the shame of being branded a father killer. Victor could not hold on to his sanity. He sank deeper into hallucinations, screaming for his parents, until he was finally moved to the prison asylum, living in endless torment. Elena felt no joy. The losses were too great, leaving behind a void nothing could fill. She had lost Ricardo, lost her sons, and lost the family she once believed would be her refuge forever. In the evening, sitting on the porch gazing at the sea, Elena often felt Ricardo's presence. In the crimson sunset, she could imagine his gentle smile, as if telling her he was still there, still watching over her. Instead of letting grief consume her, Elena chose to act. With the money left, and with Callahan's help, she founded the Ricardo Duarte Foundation, an organization to support victims of family violence and crime. She knew she was not the only one betrayed by her own blood. Out there were countless wives, mothers, husbands, even children suffering silently without escape. The foundation soon became a beacon of hope. Through her pain, Elena gave others understanding and strength. She organized talks, invited lawyers and psychologists to provide free advice. Women arrived broken and fearful, but left with lifted heads, believing that justice and hope still existed. Each time Elena handed a flower to a woman who had escaped abuse, she thought of Ricardo. She believed that somewhere he was smiling proudly because she had not fallen, because she had turned her pain into strength to save others. On the porch, with a warm cup of tea and the sound of waves rolling in, Elena found peace. She knew Ricardo had never truly left. He was in the waves, in the sunsets, and in every smile of those the foundation saved. Elena's story is not just the tragedy of one family, but a warning for us all. It shows how greed and betrayal can turn blood into enemies, but also proves that justice exists and that the strength of one determined heart can change everything. And so the story closes here, but its message endures. Cherish the love in your family. Do not let money blind your conscience. If you find this story meaningful, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support will help me continue to tell stories that move hearts, so together we can spread the belief that justice and love will always triumph over darkness.